So welcome to the Clarity Fireside Chat on crises and issues trends for 2025. We have a group of really interesting experts here on the session today. We're going to cover a broad range of the industry, digital policy, regulations, corporate. We're going to have a very interesting discussion around all facets of crisis and issues comms. We've got Catherine Colloms, a member of Clarity's Crisis Council, used to be a former director of corporate affairs at big brands such as Openreach and Paddy Power. And Catherine also has experience in both public and private sector around crises, including post-September 11th dealings and the BP Deepwater Horizon. So thank you very much, Catherine, for joining us today. We've got Caris Wormsley, Head of Research and Digital Risk at online reputation company Digitalis. Caris is also a private investigator, which is a highly exciting and intriguing job. We've got Weston Macklem, who looks after media and crisis for Heathrow Airport. Imagine that no day is the same at the world's largest airport. So very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say. And then we've got James Fredrickson, who is Senior Corporate Affairs Leader across the telecoms industry and has worked with big brands such as Vodafone and Hyperoptic. James is also a parliamentary candidate and helped with the drafting of the 2019 Conservative Manifesto. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. We're going to look at three core areas. We're going to start looking at 2024, which was obviously a very turbulent and uncertain year, and a new president in the US coming into power, looking at how that year has maybe changed and impact 2025 when it comes to the issues and the risks that we're seeing. We're then going to look onto 2025 itself to see what are the big priorities that companies have at the moment, maybe looking at it from a short-term and a long-term perspective. And then we're going to end up discussing a little bit about thoughts for the future, some of the macro trends that we see impacting the industry for even beyond 2025. But if we start off by looking at 2024, it's from a political aspect, from a financial aspect, cultural aspect, technology aspect. It's safe to say that it was a year that changed a lot. It created an awful lot of uncertainty and volatility in the market. So how does that impact what we do as crisis and reputation professionals today then? Maybe starting off with Catherine, what do you see kind of changing and kind of carrying over from last year?
As you say, Michael, 24 was definitely a year of change. We had elections in most major economies around the world. And I think what that did last year, and to a certain extent, I think a lot of this carries over to this year, is firstly create a lot of uncertainty. I think that uncertainty is probably still there, given some of the volatility and change that we're still yet to see wash through after those elections. And one of the reasons for that uncertainty staying with us is because we've seen quite a lot of regime change across lots of different economies, obviously the big ones being the UK and the US, but we're also seeing this shift to the right. And as a result, this all has knock-on implications for corporates and corporations and how they have to think about the policy and regulation and how they're navigating those environments. I think another sort of big theme from last year, and it's a continuing theme, so it's nothing new, is sort of continuing breakdown of trust between public and consumers and institutions. And that's not just sort of government institutions. I think it's also to a certain extent business, media. I think in the UK, it's been driven by a lot of things. One of the most obvious ones is obviously the Post Office Horizon IT scandal. I think that's sort of really sort of brought to the fore a sort of more corporate crisis and sort of consistent and ongoing sense of mistrust with the public about sort of big corporations and their motives. It's not been helped by some of the issues around the water companies we've seen as well. That translates, I think, into the political environment as well. I think Keir Starmer is now at his most unfavourable since taking up office 8 months ago. I think he's like net minus 41 in terms of favourability, and 2/3 of voters have negative views about him and say that they're not handling the economy well. And then if you think about some of the other big issues that we're all trying to tackle, with obviously sustainability, climate change sort of being still central in most people's minds, uh, you only have to look at LA wildfires and sort of all the other sort of global challenges we have. But some of the challenges of that as how you react are huge. So 58% of Republican voters have said climate change is having little or no effect on the communities in which they operate. So I think you've got a lot of different aspects. A number of it's still very geopolitical. You've still got a lot of uncertainty, but these consumer issues and lack of consumer trust in institutions, I think, will be a continuing theme.
Very interesting. Thank you. Weston, I mean, an airport is in many ways the kind of the center, or the kind of the for a lot of different potential risk areas. You know that better than anyone. So how do you see kind of 24 again, kind of going into 25? You obviously 25 is a big year for you. I know that.
Yeah, I think one of the key things that we saw over 2024 is actually that we're all a lot more interconnected and dependent on each other than we perhaps realize. And I'll think of a couple of examples around that. Cast your mind back to July and the CrowdStrike IT issue. This business that no one had ever heard of is integrated into the supply chains of almost every major organization across the world. And within a matter of hours, in my industry, the global aviation industry had ground to a halt. And you think, what? How did something like that happen? Then you move on to things like Ukraine or the situation in the Middle East, and looking ahead to the Trump presidency and what's going to happen with Greenland. That airspace above Greenland is one of the most traveled air corridors in the world. And if there's some military action or dispute over that involves the United States and NATO countries, the disruption there. All of these things we're not actively necessarily thinking about as a business because they don't directly sit in our ecosystem. But I think the challenge that we've seen, and coming back actually to one of Catherine's examples, she was talking about the post office scandal. Suddenly, I bet there were a lot of businesses over the summer last year thinking, is Fujitsu in my supply chain? And they probably would have discovered it was, and they had no idea. We tend to prepare for the things that we can see on the horizon that we know about. But I think the challenge that we've got to get our organizations to think about is the things that we aren't seeing, and how we're more connected to those issues than we perhaps realize.
Very interesting. Thank you. Karis, obviously one of the things that people were, really kind of, scared about, I guess, was this kind of world of in the digital space. You looked at deepfakes, misinformation, etc. That once upon a time was fiction, and this kind of crazy world of movies that very much became a reality. So what do you see from a digital kind of crisis point of view? Because that's an area that's just getting faster and more uncontrollable for many people, isn't it?
Totally. I mean, in the past year, we've basically seen the online ecosystem completely transform. And that goes from search behaviors and the way people gather information to trust, to, as Catherine mentioned, regime change. All of these have had an impact on where everyone gets their information from and how they get their information. And, we've been doing investigations into large scale disinformation campaigns for a long time. I mean, we cried wolf on deepfakes back in 2019, thinking it would be a major issue back then. And it's only really been in the past few months that we've seen them weaponized in the way that they have, especially in the corporate world. The other side is, with the regime change, we're seeing changes to the way social media moderation or removals is approached. So while, AI, deepfakes, and LLMs can be used now to create extremely sophisticated, hostile campaigns, we're also seeing a reduction in the way that we can mitigate them. So having them taken down from social media platforms is less likely now than really it ever has been. While at the same time, the level of sophistication means that it's very hard for people to detect whether what they're seeing is real or fake, whether the information that they're reading might be true or false. So we're going into quite an unprecedented era when it comes to trust in the online space.
Interesting. James, you've spent a lot of your time working both in the kind of the policy and the regulatory space, particularly in the telecoms industry. As we said before, we've got two new governments, UK, US. Public trust is maybe at its lowest point since for a very long time. How do you think that the events of 2024 again? It feels like it's been going on for ages, but it hasn't been going on for that long. But we're kind of thrown into a 2025 where the legacy of 2024 is already like, wow, right in front of us.
Well, when you think about what that legacy would be, I think one of the real challenges now for lots of different organizations will be the authenticity of their image. So one of the things we're seeing on our TV at the moment is politicians suddenly having to reset any historic comment they may have made about Donald Trump and trying to find a way to say, oh, I didn't mean it like that, or I didn't. And you'll see that writ large in regards to the geopolitical shifts that we're seeing, where lots of organizations who have passed comment in regards to what various different governments across the world have done may have seen some kind of shift in the where the government is on the political spectrum in various different makeups, and suddenly they're having to find a way of resetting their relationship with government and their various departments that they'll need. And now, if you apply that to the economic environment, now let's go back to the start of 2024. Most central banks were saying, oh, yes, capital is expensive, but it's going to come down. And interest rates are going to fall quite considerably now. And gradually that glide path of expectation has shifted and capital is still expensive. So taking that to the kind of the infrastructure side of things, where you might have some organizations that had a close and predictable relationship with government, change, new faces, new ministers, and the previous investment cycle was leaning towards capital not being so expensive. You've got a very tricky environment for the conversations that you're moving to in 2025, where you're meeting new faces. You're probably going to give them information they don't want to hear, like price rises, like mergers, like rationalization. Or you're at the other end of the spectrum where you're part of a new government's ambition for building, as we're seeing here with some of the recent announcements. I won't talk to Heathrow because I know someone here will be talking a bit more about that, I expect, but more broadly about various different infrastructure projects across the country. These are politically difficult things to navigate that previous governments have tried to get through and failed. And so if you're there saying, well, okay, I'm great that I'm part of your ambition, but actually making the economics work is getting harder. And I faced lots of resistance last time, and it's a totally new relationship. So that is very unpredictable and a difficult place to start new relationships between corporate entities and new faces in government.
Interesting. One of the big issues, of course, last year was that was on a lot of people's mind was ESG, and ESG greenwashing. We saw more B Corps. So and I think that something that people are wondering about is what were those kind of lessons learned particularly around ESG, because a lot of organizations found themselves in a bit of a tricky situation in terms of what do they communicate, what should they do, what are they expected to do, etc., which sometimes cause issues for them. Catherine, what do you think of on the where is that kind of ESG piece going in 2025 from an issues management perspective?
So I think it is an evolving debate, and there's no sort of one right answer on it. To your point about there being a lot of sort of volatility and uncertainty still, you're obviously seeing the mood music from the US and Trump potentially withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. However, despite all of that, and despite all the rhetoric around drill, baby, drill, there is still going to be significant investment in green tech in the US. So, there's hopefully some silver lining there. And again, I do think there is an expectation. It comes back to who is expected to solve this problem. Whether people believe climate change exists or not, and depending on what polls you read, more people are sort of more supportive of the science than others. But actually, even if you take the American population, nearly 2/3 say that big businesses are not doing enough to tackle climate change. So, even if there's some skepticism out there, there's still a sense that it is business's problem and business needs to fix it, probably even more so than government when it comes to particularly the sort of US public. So I think there's a lot of rhetoric out there at the moment about moving away, in particular, from sort of climate change targets. And I've certainly seen over the last sort of 5 to 10 years in terms of ESG reporting, some of that being a bit challenged, in particular by some of our financial structures and financial models, which I don't think really lend themselves very effectively supporting sustainable environmental progress as well as growth in our kind of listed companies. But I think because of that societal consumer expectation, business is going to continue to have to step up. And at the same time, you've got a ton of regulation still that's coming. You've got things like the task force on nature-related financial disclosures. You've got all this stuff coming through, which means there is still a large degree of compliance. I do think people have to be careful, as you say, in terms of that greenwashing in what they're saying. That's always been an issue in terms of window dressing around ESG. And there is an interesting debate in the UK, I think, on growth versus net zero targets. We've seen that tension play out a bit this week in some of Rachel Reeves' big announcements, including around the runway, which I'm sure we'll come to, and how you sort of balance those objectives out. And Labour is certainly not willing to sacrifice jobs for that sort of rush to net zero. So I think it's very tricky to navigate. I do think what happens, though, is you become more market specific. While you may have regulation that is potentially sort of dialed up in different markets, you are going to have to play how you're talking about ESG from a sort of corporate brand perspective slightly differently. Back to sort of the points that have been made about, and James in particular, about how you navigate your sort of political masters and backtracking on what you may or may not have said based on who's in political power. I think it's going to have to be quite specifically local in terms of how you talk about the issues. I mean, you take, and I think that's a difficult place to be in. If you're a big corporate, it's tricky. You take someone like BlackRock, who have, I'm trying to think how many trillion under management at the moment. But at the same time, you've got Paris protesters basically storming the building, saying that not enough is being done by BlackRock to invest in carbon technologies. Then you've got, on the other side, Texas pension funds refusing to deal with BlackRock because they're doing too much and trying to support a net zero industry. So I think it is tricky. I don't fundamentally see the trend of ESG changing or moving backwards, but I do think how you talk about it and potentially how you respond to it changes in different markets.
Interesting. I mean, you even heard a lot of debate around should the actual term ESG be banned because it was tainted with bad practice, which is, to your point. I mean, it's a very emotional issue. Western, as an airport, you are at the center of this. You've got it's the debate around the new runway, etc. I mean, sustainability and ESG is of course at the heart of what you're doing. What do you see anything changes in that debate and how you as a kind of a big business is tackling this?
Sure. Well, and first I would just want to come back on something Catherine was saying just then. I agree. I think if you look at the US as an example, I think US consumers have different expectations of businesses than perhaps British consumers. I think they expect businesses to take a view on a variety of issues that are in the public realm in the US, whereas I'm not sure that that's necessarily to the same extent in the UK. Specifically on carbon and green growth. I think the point James was making around authenticity is really important. A business that, as an airport, we have a role to play in the future of decarbonizing the UK and reaching net zero by 2050. We have to have a voice in that debate. We can't shy away from it. We can't be hiding our light under a bushel because a change in the White House or something like that. We have a role to play in achieving that outcome, and we have a responsibility to be a loud voice in the debate. So I think where a business is directly touched by a particular issue, our view is that they should lead the debate on that issue. When it comes to a third runway at Heathrow, we are clear that it can only happen if the airport makes sufficient progress towards decarbonizing flight. Now, we don't actually operate aircraft. We only operate the airport. The ones emitting the carbon are the aircraft using the airport. So how do we force airlines to decarbonize? Well, we've put money behind it. So at Heathrow, we've got an incentive scheme where we pay airlines to use sustainable aviation fuel at Heathrow. That's a new industry. It has to scale up. But our view is very much we need to be in front of this issue because it's existential for us and it's existential for our customers. We would encourage any other business where the issue is authentic to their brand, that they need to lead that debate. Otherwise, they risk someone else doing it for them. And in particular for us, one of the trends that we've seen evolve over the past couple of years is increase in direct action at the airport. We've seen that this past summer with Just Stop Oil. That has required us to do a lot of planning ahead of time and ask uncomfortable questions around what we are prepared to do to stop that from happening and what we aren't prepared to do. And that's a really important part of this, I think.
Interesting. If we go into, what is interesting to hear is that, of course, as we all know, but it's worth kind of reiterating that, 2024 and, what started before that has been a year of asking some very, very big questions on where do we go next? And it was interesting to follow the World Economic Forum in Davos. And the irony there was, of course, that I think that, collaboration for an intelligent age was the theme. And then, but a lot of people would feel that we are more polarized than ever. And we're getting further away, from where we should be, et cetera. So it clearly is that from 2025 onwards, there's some very big questions to be asked. And so let's talk a little bit about that in terms of, in this huge amount of issues to tackle, where do we start? Where do we think that the most urgent priority needs to be? Maybe James, you could elaborate a little bit on that.
I think that's a very, very broad question. I'm going to take that to be, when companies are thinking about horizon scanning for the year ahead, what has changed in comparison to 2024? And I think one of the regular mistakes that often creeps into that kind of thinking is it will be inevitably led by a financial lens first. So particularly in light of the topics we've already talked about and the very high cost of capital that we still see, there will be, for many organizations that were relying on a cheaper cost of capital environment, and that hasn't materialized, being very margin focused. So when they're looking at contingency plans for high impact but low likelihood events, it's very, very common for those to be some of the first things on the chopping block when you're thinking about how you can rationalize your organization. And I think my view of that is go down that path at your peril. So, for example, and then I'm going to pick this example because it's very relevant to my industry, but in the first Trump term, very quickly we moved to pressure on US ally governments implementing some form of restriction on Chinese vendors in the equipment that would go into our telecommunications networks. Now, and it'd be very easy for an organization that just would conclude that that was a low likelihood scenario to actually materialize. But as it shifted some demand away from those products, they became cheaper. So if I was applying that lens, I default into trying to take advantage of that path. And very, very quickly, I find myself in a really difficult scenario where I've got lots of parts of my network asset provided by a vendor that's now got quite a very significant restriction depending on which part of the chain you're in. And suddenly you've got an increased capital cost of swapping it out. Now, that's a great example where unlikely policy at the time became very real policy very quickly. And just applying that typical lens caught a lot of large organizations out. So I think thinking about how you structure your leadership team so that thinking is challenged, I think is really, really useful for the year ahead. Lots of organizations will tend to have the kind of functions that we're across, sometimes either direct to the CEO or into finance or into people teams. And if you have that kind of structure, the kind of voice who's looking externally at the horizon and constantly scanning to the threat that might be coming and just thinking about that on a longer term basis, you need that voice wherever you position it within your organization to be talking to the board. Because if you don't, I think it's very, very easy to default to the typical individual in these kind of positions has a term that's, you know, rarely longer than 5 years. And so if you've got a risk that you see as kind of a once in a 20, 30, 40 going on likelihood, actually, if I'm at the pinch in the financial situation, I'm going to deprioritize that. In the environment we're in, for all the reasons we've talked about already, means it is much more unstable and policy can shift and you can be caught out. So I think that's the key learning for me about how organizations should shift to get that external horizon scanning voice at the top table more regularly to challenge the easy default of margin squeeze.
Interesting. Kerry, we talk about priorities, and as we touched upon before, you know, this whole new world of misinformation, etc., I'm sure is something that is keeping a lot of people awake at night. When you know, it wasn't that long ago when you talked about, you know, digital risk and the impact of reputation, people would automatically think about cyber attacks because again, and you know, as we heard before, we've had the numerous, whether it's CrowdStrike or other big, we had massive attacks on critical national infrastructure in healthcare and finance and energy. You know, that was and I'm sure still something that a lot of organizations worry about. But again, increasingly you hear people worry about the misinformation and from a reputational perspective as well. How do you think people can best deal with this as a top priority for here and now?
So, I mean, there's a few things. One thing which is quite lucky is that even though we feel like everything is kind of quite scary and new, especially in the world of AI, actually very few attacks are original. So as soon as we notice that one has started to happen and has started gaining traction, if you take, for example, audio deepfakes, it becomes hugely popular very quickly. So being able to prepare for that in advance actually isn't as difficult as it might appear. The most important thing really is to keep on top of these trends and also how the new tools can be misused. So for example, how, say, LLMs or AI technology can be misused, how sophisticated it is, what campaigns are looking at. We do see them develop all the time, and quite often we actually see techniques that have been developed in, say, state-sponsored attacks being replicated in the corporate world, especially when it comes to disinformation and deepfakes. The ways that it's been happening recently has actually been targeting the new platforms people are carrying out searches on. So it isn't particularly helpful to just focus, say, on the original social media platforms that people are used to or that we're used to dealing with. It is important to look at the new ones, the emerging ones, and how those are being misused, how, say, campaigns are being conducted to evade moderation completely or to evade being taken down, how they're being bolstered by AI as well. Because being aware of those threats before they happen is really the best way to protect yourself from the potential issues. Say if we take deepfakes, for example, we know that it's often key figures in businesses that are targeted the most. So being aware of how much content is out there which can be used, being able to categorize it, to understand, you know, is it an image which is likely to be misused or could be, or is it something which is actually quite safe to have online? Similar with preparing the other people in the organization to understand that if someone was to target them, it might be in the form of, say, a deep fake of a trusted person that they work with, and making sure there's training around that as well. So while it seems quite scary and like there's nothing we can do about it, actually there is still a lot we can do to prepare.
I'm a Western, as you know, I know you've been talking in the past about, you know, doubt being such a you know, an important kind of focus in terms of almost doubt being the worst enemy. You know, things like misinformation and you know, the political instability that both James and Catherine talked about before has in many ways created an environment where people maybe have more doubt than ever. They have less trust in institutions, etc. I mean, how do you tackle that? Because you've got so many different stakeholders to kind of deal with, where everyone will have a certain level of doubt, and I would imagine.
Yeah, I guess in some respects, that makes our job as reputation experts really more critical in an organization. And it comes down to actually the relationships that you build with your stakeholders. I mean, I primarily speak to the media, but I work in a team who speaks with politicians and passengers, airlines, and it's those personal relationships that give us the authority to communicate with people and for that to be believed. I see our role only strengthening in the future because of misinformation, actually.
Interesting. Catherine and James, you've both talked about the importance of authenticity, and so two questions on that. Maybe starting with you, Catherine. You've also talked about culture being an, and I guess one of the big questions is, to what extent do we think that the culture of openness, transparency, and where communications is very much rooted in, what is the reality of that changing? Because clearly there is a need to be more communicative, be more assertive, instill some certainty where maybe we can. And I'm just keen to hear what you think about the cultural shift that we might see this year and beyond.
Yeah, I've got sort of two thoughts on culture. One is actually the sort of internal culture of an organization. I think that then speaks to this point around authenticity, and your license to operate and interact with stakeholders. For me, culture and reputation are absolutely intrinsically linked. How the organization operates, the culture within the organization sort of underpins how you interact with every single other stakeholder, and therefore how you are perceived. But also from a crisis perspective, the vast majority of crises are internal crises. Now, there's obviously the sort of wars of Ukraine, and there's sort of acts of God, etc. But actually, you think about sort of a lot of the crises we've sort of talked about, be it IT systems or decisions to invest in IT systems, something like BP, which is around a safety issue. And again, it's sort of back to sort of James's point about these sort of micro decisions taken potentially over time, potentially because of budgets, or because the risk process isn't quite right, or because the culture isn't right, that kind of gets to a situation where it's not necessarily a bad actor per se internally, but because the culture isn't properly interrogating and asking those challenging questions, as James says, you get to this point where you get crisis. So for me, culture is absolutely at the root of how you try to design the best protection internally to ensure that you are mitigating against those risks and against culture. But I think that then speaks to that culture of how you want to be externally. It goes a bit back to sort of what we were talking about with the sort of ESG and greenwashing. You absolutely have to be, as a corporate, entirely authentic about how you're communicating. There's a question about how much you're communicating, which, I think depending on circumstances, you can argue sometimes you don't always have to give all the information. But my sort of fundamental starting point is to be as transparent and open as possible, and have those dialogues with all stakeholders when you can. But that again comes from the internal culture. So if you have that culture internally where people are challenging, not only are you creating those kind of risk mitigations, it means that when you want to go and communicate, in particular potentially in a crisis where it can be tricky, and you've got a lot of voices sitting around a table who are worried about what you say. The classic thing has always been in crisis about apologies, because you potentially have the legal counsel sitting there saying you can't apologise, that means it's legal liability. I think we've moved in the last sort of 10 to 15 years away from that position to understand that if you have made a mistake as a company and that affects consumers, and potentially, in a number of cases, tragically, there might be deaths or other things related to that, you have to own up as a company and be authentic and transparent and talk about what went wrong and make those kind of apologies. So I think they're linked, that sort of internal culture with that culture then of authenticity in communication.
Your point about how much to say leads to a really, a difficult situation for organizations. And James, keen to hear your view on this. It's the very simple question in terms of what do you say and when? There's a huge expectations on organizations to speak out on issues, apologize when an apology is due, as Catherine mentioned. But concepts such as CEO activism and organizational activism has been around for a while. And yet we still have a huge kind of question around what do we say and when do we choose to speak out on the big issues that go beyond the organization, whether that is racism, gun control, all these things. So is there a magic kind of answer to how do you get that balance right?
Well, sadly, no magic answer, but I think what I could say to that is you will get lots of different CEOs in regards to their personality and where they are in the organization, in the sense of it being, you often get that kind of a campaigning CEO and founder-led organizations where they still see themselves very close to essentially being the embodiment of an organization because they set it up themselves. But you also get that at the other extreme where people with an extremely large voice, because they're representing a global organization, feel that they can move into that space and kind of raise awareness of particular points because of the following that they have. So it kind of at each end of the spectrum, it exists. And I think a principle I would apply to it, whether at one extreme or the other, would be if the CEO wants to take a stand on a particular position, and I emphasis there as the CEO, so not them as the individual, but them as the CEO, then the position should be authentic and sincere to the organization that they are the CEO of. So to give my own experience of seeing that where it's been very effective, my previous organization, Vorbos, they're an infrastructure builder in central London. They build fiber network assets, most of it under the streets of London. And that's the practicalities of that. That is a very manual, labor-intensive work for the people putting that physical asset in the ground. And when they were investing just shy of £1 billion in building this asset across central London, and they were recruiting for the people who would be doing that work, pretty much 100% men. And they realized, well, we've got a problem here. Half the labor market we can't even appeal to. Now, obviously, that's a problem. So from the very beginning of the organization, there was a magnifying glass on why do we have this problem? What are we going to do to fix it? And they introduced lots of things that were not a campaign at the start. They were just policy that they implemented because it was in the DNA of the organization to create an environment that was breaking down barriers for women taking roles in a particularly male-dominated industry. And so the company grew up with that. So it became very authentic for the founder CEO to have a position to say, I would like government to be doing more of these things. It's helped my organization. It's helped the communities that we work in, and it's making a better environment overall and attracting investment into an area that we think needs it. I think that worked really well. A danger, I think, is if you see that success, sometimes individuals can think, well, I'm going to take that into other places. And I think that there is the danger then of undermining that sincerity and authenticity. Do that at your peril. Suddenly you're a politician trying to say why you didn't mean all the things you said about Donald Trump. So they're the two key things for me. I know we've talked about authenticity, but it being genuinely sincere to the history of the organization, I think is really key. Because if someone does want to challenge you and they feel like the CEO is jumping on the bandwagon of a bigger debate and maybe they're doing it for other reasons, you can always defend the organization by pointing to the track record and proving that it's genuinely meaningful to the organization. And I think increasingly people see that for what it is. I think people will see through where it's an organization maybe jumping on the back of a trend versus an organization where if they choose to go and do a bit of digging into why they might be taking that stand, they can see it for what it's worth. And I think that's a real new challenge for a lot of organizations where previously a lot of that might have just been through the lens of a small group of journalists that might be listening to a CEO who might have a particular position on policy. Now it's as easy as writing on X, or get various different platforms where the CEO might have a presence because they use it to represent the organization. It can happen much more quickly. So that principle becomes even more valuable because most of the time you're giving that message directly to your customers or potential customers.
I mean, Weston, how is this kind of reflected at in the world of Heathrow? Because you're in a situation where you are expected, I guess, to speak out on a lot of issues, or asked to speak out on a lot of issues, whether they are political, business, or anything. What kind of guidelines do you have? Where do you draw the line?
Well, I think to James's very well considered point, it needs to be relevant to us. There's a lot of stuff that we could comment on, but it's not really a place for us to voice a view, even if we may have one. I think the other thing that's important for businesses to remember, and it's something that we actively strive towards, is to be very clear that nothing we say is party political. So we have a founding principle that if we do take a view on something, it's about a policy. It's not about a party. Heathrow expansion is a great example. We've been through how many different governments backing this project. We know that it requires cross-party support. So we need to be very careful not to alienate anyone and their views. Brexit was a very difficult time for us, but we were able to have a clear position on that was authentic and relevant because we are the country's biggest port. We naturally have a stake in the outcome of that debate. And where we were commenting, it was more to inform the public sphere about what we know, given we're involved in this area, rather than to take a party political position.
Interesting. We are coming up to the hour, so I just want to, it's been fascinating to hear all of this. We could literally speak here all day, but everyone's got jobs to do. But let's end with a thought, a takeaway thought, a parting shot, so to speak, on what we think is going to be the big trend for the future. If we sit here in 2-4 years' time and talk, what will we look back on as the big thing when it came to issues, crisis management, protecting reputation, etc. Karis, if we start with you, what would be your kind of takeaway?
I think really just it's quite hard even thinking next year what the online ecosystem is going to look like and how people get their information. But the key thing really to kind of bear in mind is that it is a very it's something that's moving constantly. It's not something that we're necessarily going to be able to predict. But certainly the most important thing is going to be to just stay on top of those developments, see, where the search landscape is going, where people are getting their information from, and how trust is changing.
Fantastic. Catherine, what would your, final words be?
I think mine would be, it speaks a bit to Karis and also James's point. So I think we are going to see more sort of black swan, unlikely type events. We didn't see COVID coming. We didn't see Ukraine coming. And you think about, of all the things we've talked about globally and to us as humanity and consumers and corporates, it's those things that have caused the biggest disruption. So I think that kind of physical disruption from somewhere which you can't potentially predict, that's not going away. And so back to James's point, I think you need to be looking at your risk registers to sort of really think about those unlikely potential scenarios, because it's more likely, unfortunately, they may come to pass.
James, what about you?
Expanding on Catherine's point, I think if I had to couch how I see 2025 might pan out in regards to crisis, it would be really review your supply chains and really understand each part and how it interacts with the next. If we are going to see more of these black swans, kind of high impact, low likelihood scenarios, and the typical rules of the institutions that our organizations work within being not as stable as they may have been in the past, then your sensitivity will typically be on a piece of policy or a political reaction or an external event that happens, and you don't immediately identify how it impacts you. but far down in your supply chain, there could be an impact, and it can have a consequential knock-on onto your organization that if you haven't done the due diligence to really understand how your component parts ultimately feed into your business, then you're leaving yourself with that risk, and that risk profile is growing. So supply chain disruption in some form or another, becoming a more regular creator of crisis and prompting organizations to react more aggressively and more quickly is what I somewhat depressingly expect we'll see in 2025.
Lovely. Weston, what about you?
I guess I'm interested to see how the social media landscape changes over the next year. I think we've seen the trend of people sort of leaving X, or X becoming more of an echo chamber. We see TikTok, I know there's talk of a potential ban in the United States, but also at the same time, content creators from TikTok getting access to White House journalist passes. How is the social media landscape going to change, and how does that impact how we get our message across? Will be something we'll be paying attention to.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. As all these things go, we should do this again in a few months' time, because as we said, the world is moving so fast, and I bet you everything that we've talked about now will maybe look different just then. So thank you so much again, and really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us today.